Imagine waking up in a body that does not belong to you, but to God, your family, and the heavy weight of an entire era's expectations. In medieval Europe, virginity was more than a biological state. It was an invisible armour, a ticket to avoid the abyss of absolute social rejection and ruin. Purity was the highest currency a woman could possess, a spiritual treasure guarded by the church and used as a shield against the harshness of the world. The sound of the cathedral bells was a constant reminder of divine order, signalling that every soul was property of the heavens and bound by sacred law. Walking through these hallowed halls, one felt the eyes of stone saints watching, measuring the weight of every thought and the cleanliness of every hidden desire. Art from this period often showed virgins surrounded by demons, yet they remained emotionless, their internal strength reflected in their unwavering and stoic expressions of faith. This was the spiritual battlefield where the flesh was considered a burden and the soul was a garden that had to be weeded with constant prayer. To be pure was to be a living icon, a vessel of honour that kept the family's name untarnished and their lineage connected to the Holy Spirit. Behind every closed door in this village, the value of a daughter was measured by her chastity, a fragile bond that held the community's morality together. Laws were written in cold ink, defining the boundaries of a woman's body as the property of her father until passed to a husband under God. The convent was often the only refuge for those who sought to escape the pressures of marriage, yet even there the walls were thick with rules. Taking the veil meant becoming a bride of Christ, a choice that elevated a woman's status to the highest peak of medieval purity and spiritual devotion. Their lives were a performance of silence and sacrifice, a daily ritual designed to keep the world's corruption from entering the sacred space of the mind. The hortus conclusus, or enclosed garden, symbolized the virginity of Mary, a physical metaphor for a soul that remained locked away from the sins of men. Every ritual, from baptism to the Eucharist, reinforced the idea that the body was a temple that could be easily desecrated by a single mistake. The fear of falling from grace was a physical weight, a constant pressure that made every heartbeat feel like a step on a very narrow ledge. Even amidst the chaos of war and the violence of the era, the concept of the pure maiden remained a symbol of what men fought to protect. Chivalry demanded that knights honour the purity of noble women, creating a complex social dance where honour and chastity were two sides of the same coin. But this ideal was a heavy burden, a pedestal so high that any slip meant a fall into a darkness from which few ever truly returned. Contrast this holy silence with the reality of the medieval market, where life was loud, messy, and filled with the constant temptation of the physical. The Church struggled to reconcile the image of the Virgin Mary with the earthly reality of common women who worked, loved, and lived in the mud. To bridge this gap, bizarre medical theories emerged, claiming they could determine a woman's purity through the simple inspection of her urine or her gait. They believed that a virgin walked with a certain lightness, while the fallen carried the weight of their sin in the very way their hips moved. Suspicion was a social disease. Neighbours watched neighbours, and families guarded their daughters like prisoners to ensure their market value remained intact for marriage. While the sermons preached asceticism, the reality was often far less holy, with many clergy members living lives that mocked the very purity they demanded. The hypocrisy was stark. Men who indulged in every vice were the same ones who sat in judgment over a girl's supposedly impure thoughts. Nobles feasted on the finest riches while preaching that the poor should find their fulfillment in spiritual hunger and the denial of the flesh. She would spend hours in the cold begging for forgiveness for a dream or a glance that the church deemed unclean and spiritually dangerous. In a world of immense hardship, the wealthy could afford to carry their comforts with them, even into the heart of a bloody war zone. For a woman, her only bed of luxury was her reputation, and it was a bed she had to defend with her very life every day. The rules were a moving target, designed to keep women in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing if they were truly pure enough. The street was a place of danger, where a single rumour could destroy a family's standing, turning a respected daughter into a social pariah overnight. This was the survival game of the Middle Ages, where the stakes were your soul and your survival depended on a biological technicality. They were taught to fear their own bodies, to see their natural desires as a trap set by the devil to lead them into eternal fire. The pulpit was a place of power, where words were used to bind the imagination and restrict the freedom of an entire gender for centuries. Control was not just spiritual, it was physical. manifested in the way women were moved like chess pieces across the board of dynastic politics. A woman's purity was her dowry, the literal price tag that determined which alliances her father could forge with other powerful families in the realm. Within those high walls, the obsession with lineage and blood meant that a single act of impurity could collapse an entire noble house's future. Purity was not just a matter of faith. It became a technical battle, a set of secret survival skills passed down through whispers and shadows. Midwives and healers held the keys to ancient recipes, concocting herbal mixtures designed to restore what was lost or hide the truth from prying eyes. The science of the time was a blend of superstition and desperation, searching for ways to fix the unfixable in a world that allowed no mistakes. The use of animal blood or red dyes was a common deception on wedding nights, a high-stakes performance to prove a bride's supposed innocence to her husband. Alum was used to astringe the skin, a painful and primitive method to physically simulate the tightness associated with a virgin state for the skeptical. Leeches were sometimes employed in these desperate rituals, part of a brutal medical theatre that many women endured to avoid a life of total shame. Though the infamous chastity belt is largely a historical myth, the symbolic locking away of a woman's body was a very real and daily reality. Like a soldier stuffing straw into his tunic to survive the winter, women armoured their minds with thousands of rigid rules against social judgment. Every stitch in their embroidery was a lesson in patience and restraint, a way to occupy the mind so it wouldn't wander into forbidden territory. They lived in a world of symbols where a dropped flower or an unfastened collar could be interpreted as a sign of a decaying moral character. Knowledge was shared in secret, tips on how to appear modest, how to lower the eyes, and how to speak without revealing too much spirit. If purity was a garden, then these women were the constant gardeners, fighting against the storms of reality to keep their social value from being washed away. Sweetness and docility were the required flavours of a clean soul. Anything sour or sharp was seen as a symptom of a corrupted inner life. The isolation was profound. To be accused was to be left alone in a frozen wilderness where no one would dare offer a hand of help. They understood that their status was as fragile as a snowflake, beautiful but destined to vanish the moment it was touched by the heat of truth. Their lives were stored in boxes of reputation, packed away and guarded, only to be opened under the strict supervision of the men in their lives. The shadow of their reputation preceded them everywhere they went, often becoming more important than the actual person living inside that shadow. A single mistake could blot out an entire lifetime of devotion, an irreversible stain that the church taught could never truly be washed away on earth. Inside these pure vessels were human beings with dreams and fears that the world around them refused to acknowledge or even see. The fear of spoilage was used as a metaphor to control young girls, comparing their bodies to fruit that lost its value once it was touched. The wings of their ambition were clipped by the requirements of their virtue, keeping them grounded in the narrow path assigned to them by birth. They saw themselves through a glass darkly, never allowed to witness their own worth outside of the rigid definitions of purity and obedience. This technical battle for purity was a full-time occupation, a constant labour of maintenance that defined every hour of a medieval woman's existence. Even in death, their virtue was carved into their headstones, a final statement to the world that they had successfully navigated the minefield of life. They aimed for a stillness of soul that mirrored a calm lake, where not a single ripple of scandal was allowed to disturb the perfect surface. But beneath that surface, the current of human nature still pulled, a silent force that the rules could never completely extinguish. If Trintiet was the measure of dignity, then its loss was a social death sentence, a public execution of one's place in the world. Forced haircutting was a common mark of shame, a physical sign to the community that this woman was no longer under the protection of honour. The crowd's mockery was a weapon, a collective act of cruelty that reinforced the boundaries of what was considered acceptable and pure for everyone else. Those who failed the tests of purity often found themselves locked in cells of stone and silence, hidden away to protect the community from their pollution. Legal records from the time are filled with the testimonies of those who were ruined by a single accusation. Their lives reduced to cold ink. You didn't just lose a membrane, you lost the right to be human, the right to be protected by your family and your God. Even blood ties were severed by the sword of purity, as families would rather disown a child than bear the zistog, the stain of her perceived impurity. The doors of society didn't just close, they were bolted shut, leaving the fallen woman to survive on the fringes of existence, if she survived at all. Many were driven into the wilderness of poverty, forced into the very life of sin they were once taught to fear more than death itself. Marriage was no longer an option for the stained, and without a husband or a convent, a woman had no legal standing in the medieval world. The weight of this loss was a heavy, mournful note that played throughout a woman's life, a melody of regret that never truly ended. Every day was a battle for a dignity that had already been stripped away, a struggle to find a reason to continue in a world that hated you. The community's judgment was like a swarm, overwhelming and impossible to escape once it had chosen its target for the day's moral execution. Life became a series of small, miserable humiliations, a slow draining of the spirit that was often more cruel than any physical punishment. The temptation to end the suffering was a constant companion for those who had been cast out of the light of social acceptance and grace. Repentance was offered, but it was a path of thorns designed to keep the sinner in a state of eternal apology and visible humble shame. Labour was the only way to cleanse the soul, a physical penance that turned a woman's body into a tool for someone else's moral satisfaction. The symbol of their purity was now just a rag, a haunting reminder of a version of themselves that the world had decided no longer existed. Even the innocent were taught to participate in the shaming, ensuring that the next generation understood the high cost of failing the social order. Some survived into old age as ghosts of the community, warnings to young girls of what happens when you dare to be more than a statue. In the end, many unclean women were buried in unconsecrated ground, denied even the final piece of a holy rest next to their ancestors. Their stories were sunsed, their names erased from family trees, as if the very memory of them was a contagion that had to be destroyed. The chains of purity were both physical and psychological, a prison that didn't need bars because the walls were built into the mind itself. One moment, one choice, one rumour. The impact rippled outward until it destroyed everything a woman had ever known or hoped for herself. But even the strongest walls of dogma could not completely stop the human spirit from seeking its own light, even in the deepest shadows. In those small moments of quiet rebellion, the fallen found a different kind of purity, one based on survival and the truth of their own hearts. We look back at the Middle Ages with shock and irony, but have the chains of purity truly disappeared from our modern high-tech world? Perhaps they have only changed their warp, moving from iron belts and stone cells to the digital screens and the impossible standards of beauty. The gaze is still there, weighing, measuring and judging the value of a person based on their appearance and the perfection of their life story. We still live in a world obsessed with stains, where a single viral mistake can lead to a modern version of the medieval town square shaming. The tools of judgment are faster now, but the impulse remains the same, to define a human being by what they have lost or kept. The past is never truly gone. It lives in the architecture of our thoughts and the way we still demand perfection from the vulnerable. The new nuns of the modern era are those who chase the holy grail of an unachievable, airbrushed innocence that only exists in the digital realm. The pressure to be pure in style, in reputation and in health continues to haunt the quiet moments of the next generations growing up. We are still terrified of the stain, of being found wanting in the eyes of an invisible audience that never stops watching or judging. Our laws have changed, but the social survival instincts that turned purity into a weapon are still buried deep within our collective psychological DNA. We devour the fall of others with a hunger that would be familiar to a medieval crowd, finding safety in the ruin of another's name. The symbols remain, but their meaning has been commodified, turned into products and slogans that sell the dream of a clean and perfect life. Can we ever truly see a person beyond their labels? Or are we destined to forever repeat the cycles of the Middle Ages in different skins? History is a mirror that shows us how far we've come, but also how much of the old shadows we still carry within our modern hearts. The market is always open, and the price of dignity is still being negotiated every day into the comment sections and the headlines of the world. We try to erase the past, to cleanse our digital identities, but some stains are part of the story of what it means to be human. The ideas of the Middle Ages are like seeds. They travel through time, landing in new soil, and growing into familiar patterns of control and judgment. The search for purity is often a search for escape, a desire to be something more than a messy, complicated, and imperfect biological being. Middle Ages are not just a time in a history book. They are a mindset that still defines the value of a person by what they have left. Nature doesn't care about our definitions of purity. It only knows life, death, and the constant uncaring flow of time through the ages. The door to that era is closing, but the echoes of its bells still ring in the way we look at each other and ourselves today. True dignity is not found in a state of purity, but in the resilience to grow and find beauty in a world that is inherently messy. Medieval times are not far away. They are within us in every definition of worth based on what someone has kept or lost. The end.